On November 23, 1946, French military vessels began to shell the Vietnamese city of Haiphong after a minor clash with the Viet Minh over the enforcement of customs laws, shattering the fragile ceasefire between the Viet Minh and France. 4 days and several thousand dead Vietnamese later, any hopes of Vietnam's continued existence as a French subsidiary state were dashed. The First Indochina War had begun. Over the course of the next 8 years, the Viet Minh would grow from a small, poorly equipped group of guerrillas into a massive army, capable of challenging a modern industrial state like France. The war would be long and bloody, but in the end, the Viet Minh would reign victorious over the French, winning their long-awaited independence in the process. Aside from establishing North Vietnam as a sovereign nation, setting the stage for American military operations in the region 2 decades later, the First Indochina War proved disastrous for the French. Not only was the war incredibly expensive in lives and resources, but losing Indochina effectively ended French colonial ambitions in Asia as well. But how, exactly, did a ragtag group of barely armed peasants not only challenge, but successfully defeat a modern industrial army? You would be forgiven for thinking, as the French almost certainly did, that the war would be a short, simple affair. After all, the Viet Minh were more of an armed gang, and a poorly armed one at that, than an army. But you would be wrong in that assumption, and, with the benefit of hindsight, we can observe that there were several factors present from the beginning of the war that gave an inherent advantage to the Viet Minh. The first, and arguably most important advantage of the Viet Minh were the people in charge of it. Ho Chi Minh, who had founded the group in 1941 to fight the Japanese who occupied the country at that time, was instrumental to the formation and success of the Viet Minh. Simply put, Ho, more so than any other Vietnamese leader, was responsible for keeping the Viet Minh together. He managed to marry the varied species of nationalism present in Vietnam at the time, sewing the disorganized and inert fragments of rebellion spread across the country into a continuous tapestry of resistance. The degree to which Ho himself was a communist, as opposed to a pure nationalist, is a hotly debated topic and won't be discussed in great detail here, but it is obvious that he was at least sympathetic to the communist cause. Regardless of Ho's personal ideological convictions, he made a concerted effort to make the Viet Minh appear as a nationalist organization. Ho himself said, "It was nationalism, not communism, that inspired me," and Allison Thomas, an American OSS agent who met Ho Chi Minh, was adamant in his after-action report that the Viet Minh League was not communist, quote, "stands for freedoms and reforms from French harshness," end quote. Furthermore, Ho took several steps within Vietnam to tamp down his communist rhetoric in an effort to appeal to a larger portion of the population. Generally, more Vietnamese were nationalists than were communists. By tying the Viet Minh to Vietnamese nationalism as opposed to a grand communist revolution, Ho greatly expanded the broader appeal of the Viet Minh. Had he insisted that the Viet Minh was a purely communist organization devoted to ushering in the global revolution, many Vietnamese likely would not have supported it. At the same time, while playing up the nationalistic aspects of the Viet Minh, Ho retained enough of an image among Vietnam's communists to attract them to the group. In the end, Ho managed to unite the Vietnamese, at least the ones in Tonkin, to his cause, gaining massive widespread appeal among the country, which would allow them to persevere through the coming conflict. While Ho Chi Minh's pragmatism may have paved the way for the Viet Minh to become the most influential independence group in Indochina, he lacked the military skills to successfully wage a war against anyone, much less an overwhelming European power. Luckily for the Viet Minh, Ho wasn't in charge of military operations. That distinct honor belonged to Va Wen Giap, who would prove to be one of the greatest military commanders in modern history, as well as, arguably, the single most important reason that the Viet Minh managed to defeat the French. Giap, who had no military education whatsoever outside of a few classical military textbooks, such as The Art of War, proved masterful at asymmetric warfare. On paper, Giap was facing an impossible situation. The French maintained complete air superiority, fielded hundreds of armored vehicles, and deployed well-trained professional soldiers. Against this, Giap commanded a dangerously small, pitifully equipped force of militia. Many Viet Minh didn't even have guns, resorting to machetes and spears instead. With this in mind, Giap retreated to the mountainous jungle of the northernmost reaches of Tonkin province, where French tanks and planes were next to useless, and the roads were too sparse to supply a dedicated French assault. Giap brilliantly utilized the Viet Minh's few advantages, primarily their ability to traverse the jungle and a supporting populace behind French lines, to nullify the French advantages of air and mechanized power. By avoiding decisive battles with the French unless victory was highly probable, Giap managed to avoid catastrophic defeat, keeping the Viet Minh alive and well. By ambushing and cutting French supply lines and harassing French outposts, Giap managed to take the initiative away from the French and turn what was previously a mechanized massacre of the Vietnamese into a prolonged war of attrition. By ingeniously concealing the Viet Minh's movements, Giap was repeatedly able to concentrate large numbers of Viet Minh in one place completely unbeknownst to the French, achieving local superiority long enough to win the battle and then melt back into the jungle before French reinforcements arrived. This element of surprise was only heightened by local irregular units who would mobilize to join the Viet Minh for a battle only to return to their villages afterwards, making every civilian a potential insurgent. All of these individual tactics had one sum total. The French were fighting on Giap's terms, not the other way around. By keeping the Viet Minh amorphous, with no real front line or permanent deployments for the French to attack, Giap ensured that he could choose where and when he wanted to fight, meaning that he was never forced to engage the French army on anything less than ideal terms. All told, without Giap, it is highly uncertain whether the Viet Minh would have been able to defeat the French. Under his command, the Viet Minh managed to halt and eventually defeat a force that, on paper at least, was superior in every conceivable way. Without him, Vietnam may very well have ceased to exist in 1946. Having said this, Giap's strategic acumen wasn't the only military advantage possessed by the Viet Minh. Geographically speaking, Vietnam was an ideal location for a guerrilla insurgency. The jungles and mountains of Vietnam are highly favorable to Giap's style of command, and indeed, without them, many of his signature tactics would be hard, if not impossible, to pull off. If Vietnam were entirely flat and open, for example, the Viet Minh wouldn't have had any readily available refuge from French tanks or planes, and the establishment of permanent Viet Minh bases would have been nearly impossible as a consequence of this. With no impassable geographic barrier, French armor would have been able to run rampant throughout the country, giving no respite to the Viet Minh, and French planes would have been able to easily spot and massacre Viet Minh. It cannot be overstated how much of Giap's tactics relied on the mountains and jungle of his country. The mountains and jungle were key to both halting the French movements and concealing his own. In this way, Vietnam owes its independence to its very climate. Aside from these inherent Vietnamese advantages, present in their leaders and their geography, the Viet Minh had one other advantage: Chinese support. In 1949, the Chinese Communists finally defeated the Nationalists, taking control of the whole country. Almost overnight, the Viet Minh's prospects dramatically improved. The presence of a supportive communist government to the north meant that, for the first time, the Viet Minh would receive a steady line of supplies donated by the Chinese and Soviets. Furthermore, the Chinese military began to train units of Viet Minh, sent there to learn proper military tactics. The Viet Minh, who had managed to hold off and harass the French for 3 years with little in the way of proper equipment or training, would soon have a properly outfitted army at their disposal, and they made sure to use it. In 1950, after building up a sizable regular army, equipped and trained by the Chinese, the Viet Minh began their first tangible offensive against the French. Up to this point, Viet Minh operations had consisted mainly of small-scale harassment against the French, but now, after securing their position in the mountains, they were ready to start taking back Tonkin. The massacre along the French road RC4 was the first major Viet Minh victory in the war, marking a turning point in the conflict, and it would have been impossible without Chinese support. While it's possible that the Viet Minh may have still won their independence without the Chinese, they certainly wouldn't have been ready for major offensive operations as soon as 1950. Thus, foreign aid from China can be considered essential to the Viet Minh victory. Perhaps no single battle demonstrated the inherent advantages possessed by the Viet Minh as the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. In 1953, the war was not going well for France. Unable to pin down the Viet Minh in an open battle, the French were helpless against Giap's guerrilla tactics. They needed to force a decisive battle. As such, the French elected to entrench their army in the remote city of Dien Bien Phu, tucked away in the mountains, far from the French supply lines. Reasoning that they could supply the base from the air, the French hoped to coax the Viet Minh into a prolonged siege, a siege they were confident that they could win. Instead, the numerous military advantages of the Viet Minh proved too much for France, and the French forces surrendered after a 167-day siege. The mountains surrounding Dien Bien Phu proved to be perfect positioning for Viet Minh artillery, and Viet Minh soldiers, armed and trained by the Chinese, worked day and night to creep closer to the French lines, digging trenches toward them and tunneling under them. The heavy cover of the trees made French air retaliation and counter-battery fire ineffective, and the constant Vietnamese shelling made the much-touted air resupply of the French nearly impossible. In the end, the French proved unable to withstand the siege and were forced to capitulate. All of the advantages of the Viet Minh, Sop's mastery of guerrilla tactics, the favorable geography of Tonkin province, and the foreign aid from China came together to deliver a decisive blow to the French war machine. Dien Bien Phu is a microcosm of the First Indochina War as a whole. The reasons for the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, broadly speaking, are the same reasons for the French loss in the war as a whole. It was France's inability to counter these advantages that cost them the war and their colony. The First Indochina War ended shortly after the surrender of the French army at Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam was finally an independent nation, even though it had been partitioned into two halves. Decades of violence still awaited the region, but never more would Vietnam exist as a colony of another power. To many, this seemed a rapid, almost unbelievable development. How had a poor, backwards colony like Vietnam managed to defeat a country like France? To those looking closely, however, it was no surprise. The reasons for the Viet Minh victory were, and still are, plain as day to those who care to look.